I'm sorry to bother you.
It's not a big deal, ma'am.
Ethan Cole had learned that people only noticed a mechanic when something stopped working. Nobody saw the hours spent lying on cold concrete beneath a transmission. Nobody saw the unpaid invoices stacked in a coffee tin under the counter. And nobody saw the single father sitting alone in a dark garage after closing time, calculating whether the electricity bill could wait another week without the power being shut off again. His shop, Cole's Auto and Truck Repair, stood at the far edge of Dayton, Ohio, where the industrial district gave way to abandoned warehouses and cracked asphalt roads that the city seemed to have forgotten existed. The sign outside buzzed unevenly when the weather was damp, and the waiting room contained exactly 3 plastic chairs, a vending machine that hadn't worked in years, and a faded photograph of Ethan holding his daughter Lily on the day the garage first opened. That photograph was only 4 years old, but sometimes it felt like it belonged to another lifetime. Back then he had still believed that working hard was enough to keep a family together. Then came the layoffs at the manufacturing plant where he had worked as a diagnostics technician, followed by the long months of temporary jobs, the arguments about money, and finally the divorce papers that arrived in an envelope thick enough to make his hands shake before he even opened it. Lily lived with her mother most weekdays now, visiting Ethan on weekends whenever his work schedule allowed, and the silence of the garage after closing had become the loudest part of his life. That Thursday afternoon had already been worse than most. A commercial customer had postponed payment on a fleet repair, the landlord had left a voicemail reminding Ethan that he was 2 months behind on rent for the property, and the bank account connected to the shop contained less than $80. He had just finished replacing a fuel pump in an old pickup when thunder rolled across the Ohio sky and heavy rain began hammering the metal roof hard enough to drown out the radio. Ethan locked the front office, grabbed his jacket, and headed for his rusted Ford tow truck, hoping to get home before the storm flooded the low roads near his apartment. He was halfway down County Route 18 when he spotted a silver Lexus SUV sitting crookedly on the shoulder with its hazard lights blinking weakly through the rain. An elderly woman stood beside it holding a useless umbrella that the wind kept turning inside out while traffic sprayed sheets of water across the roadside without slowing down. Ethan hesitated for only a second before pulling over. He was tired, soaked, and nearly broke, but leaving her there in that weather wasn't something he could have lived with afterward. The woman looked relieved enough to cry when he approached. "I'm sorry to bother you," she said, her voice trembling slightly from the cold. "It just died all at once." Ethan introduced himself, took the keys, and opened the hood while rainwater ran down the back of his neck. What he expected to find was a dead battery or a loose terminal. What he found instead made him pause. A sensor harness near the engine control module had been cut cleanly through, not frayed, not corroded, but sliced with something sharp and deliberate. Another connector had been partially disconnected and forced back into place at an angle that would cause intermittent failure after a few miles of driving. Ethan had spent enough years around vehicles to know the difference between wear and sabotage, and this was sabotage. He kept his expression neutral so he wouldn't frighten the woman, then used spare wire and electrical tape from his truck to create a temporary repair. 20 minutes later the engine started smoothly as though nothing had ever been wrong. The woman's shoulders sagged with relief. She introduced herself as Margaret Langford and tried to hand him a small envelope of cash, but Ethan gently pushed it back toward her. "Keep it," he said. "Just have someone you trust inspect the vehicle before you drive it very far." She studied him for a moment with surprising intensity, then asked for the name of his garage. Ethan handed her a worn business card from his wallet, embarrassed by the grease smudges on the edges. As she placed it carefully in her purse, he noticed a leather folder on the passenger seat stamped with the logo of Langford Mobility Group, one of the largest transportation technology companies in the Midwest. Before he could think much about it, Margaret thanked him again and drove away through the rain. Ethan watched the taillights disappear into the storm, unaware that the simple decision to help a stranded stranger for free had just placed him directly in the path of a conspiracy powerful enough to destroy careers, fortunes, and possibly lives. Back at the garage, Ethan couldn't shake the image of that perfectly severed wire. He had seen thousands of mechanical failures over the years, from rusted brake lines to melted wiring harnesses, but this had been different. The cut was too precise, the damaged connector too intentionally disturbed. Instead of going home, he switched the office lights back on, pulled an old spiral notebook from a drawer, and began sketching the engine layout from memory. As the rain continued drumming against the roof, he mapped the location of each altered component and slowly realized what bothered him most. Whoever had tampered with the Lexus hadn't tried to make it fail immediately. The damage was designed to create an intermittent shutdown that could occur after the vehicle had been driven for several miles, the kind of failure that would easily be blamed on age, moisture, or an electrical glitch. Ethan was staring at his notes when the shop phone rang a little after 11 o'clock, the sudden sound startling him badly enough that he nearly knocked over his coffee mug. He expected a customer with a towing emergency. Instead, a calm female voice said, "Is this Ethan Cole, the mechanic who assisted Margaret Langford tonight?" Ethan confirmed that it was. The woman introduced herself as Victoria Langford, Chief Executive Officer of Langford Mobility Group, and her tone carried none of the warmth her mother had shown on the roadside. "My mother tells me you were alone with her vehicle for nearly half an hour," she said. "I'd like to know exactly what you did to it." Ethan leaned back in his chair, instantly understanding that this was not a thank you call. He explained evenly that the SUV had already been disabled when he arrived and described the severed harness, the loose connector, and the temporary repair he had performed so Margaret could get home safely. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When Victoria spoke again, the suspicion in her voice had been replaced by something sharper and more dangerous. "Are you absolutely certain the wire was cut intentionally?" she asked. "Yes," Ethan replied without hesitation. "I'd stake my reputation on it." Another silence followed, shorter this time but far heavier. Then Victoria lowered her voice and said, "Mr. Cole, my mother's vehicle was serviced this afternoon by technicians from our own executive transportation division. If what you're telling me is true, someone with authorized access may have sabotaged that SUV." Ethan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the rain. Before he could ask another question, Victoria told him she would be contacting him again in the morning and ended the call. He sat motionless for several seconds, listening to the dial tone hum in his ear. The next morning arrived gray and humid. Ethan had barely slept when a black Mercedes sedan rolled into the cracked parking lot outside the garage, followed by a second vehicle carrying 2 security personnel. Victoria Langford stepped out wearing a navy business suit that looked impossibly expensive against the backdrop of rusted tool cabinets and stained concrete floors. She was younger than Ethan had expected, perhaps early 40s, composed and intimidating in the way of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected thousands of employees. Without wasting time on pleasantries, she asked to see the parts he had removed from her mother's SUV. Ethan produced the severed section of wire and the damaged connector from a small tray on his workbench. Victoria examined them carefully, and for the first time since arriving, her expression showed genuine concern. "Our internal report claimed the breakdown was caused by water intrusion," she said quietly. Ethan shook his head. "Water doesn't make a clean cut like that." Victoria looked around the modest garage, taking in the patched roof, the aging equipment, and the stack of overdue invoices partially hidden beneath a service manual. "I misjudged you last night," she admitted. "I thought you were looking for an opportunity to take advantage of my mother." Ethan wiped his hands on a rag and gave a tired half-smile. "If I were looking for opportunities, I probably wouldn't be working here." To his surprise, the corner of Victoria's mouth twitched slightly, as though she appreciated the honesty. Then her expression hardened again. "I need you to come with me," she said. "Because if someone inside my company tampered with my mother's vehicle, this is no longer just a roadside repair." An hour later, Ethan found himself standing inside the glass and steel headquarters of Langford Mobility Group, feeling painfully aware of the grease stains that no amount of scrubbing had completely removed from his hands. Employees in tailored suits moved through the lobby carrying tablets and coffee cups, and more than one person glanced at him with open curiosity as Victoria led him toward a restricted engineering floor. The contrast between her world and his could not have been sharper. She brought him into a secure conference room where several senior engineers were already waiting beside a large display filled with diagnostic charts and vehicle telemetry reports. None of them looked pleased to see a small-town mechanic in their meeting. Victoria introduced him simply as the technician who repaired my mother's SUV, carefully avoiding any suggestion that she trusted him yet. One of the engineers, a man named Richard Hale, folded his arms and said, with respect, "Victoria, our transportation division has already determined the incident was caused by a faulty moisture seal." Ethan asked if he could review the diagnostic logs from the vehicle. Richard hesitated, but Victoria nodded and handed Ethan a tablet. He spent several minutes scrolling through the data, ignoring the impatient looks around the room. What he found made his stomach tighten. Tiny sensor voltage fluctuations had been recorded nearly 30 minutes before the breakdown, and each fluctuation had been automatically categorized by the system as environmental interference rather than a critical fault. The pattern was eerily similar to the behavior he had observed in the damaged wiring. "These readings were suppressed," Ethan said quietly. Richard gave a dismissive laugh. "That's impossible. The system flags all critical anomalies automatically." Ethan pointed to a sequence of overwritten timestamps buried beneath the visible report. "Not if someone altered the classification routine first." The room fell noticeably quieter. Victoria stepped closer to examine the screen, her expression sharpening as she followed the highlighted entries. Ethan explained that the vehicle appeared to have been programmed to misreport certain electrical failures as harmless environmental noise, making deliberate tampering far less likely to attract attention during a routine inspection. Before anyone could respond, the conference room door opened and a tall silver-haired man entered carrying the effortless authority of someone who expected every conversation to stop when he arrived. Victoria's posture stiffened slightly. "Ethan," she said, "this is Charles Whitaker, chairman of the Langford Mobility Group Board." Whitaker's smile was polite but cold. "I understand we've invited a roadside mechanic to audit our engineering department." A few nervous chuckles escaped from around the table. Ethan remained calm. "I'm not auditing anyone. I'm pointing out that the failure pattern in your executive vehicle appears intentional." Whitaker's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. "That's a serious accusation from someone without access to our full technical architecture." "I don't need access to know what a cut wire looks like," Ethan replied. The chairman turned to Victoria. "This is exactly why sensitive investigations should remain inside the company. We're discussing autonomous transportation systems worth billions of dollars, not a broken pickup truck in a neighborhood garage." Victoria didn't answer immediately, and Ethan could see the pressure she was under. Challenging the chairman publicly was clearly not something she could do lightly. Whitaker instructed the engineers to continue their internal review and suggested that Ethan's involvement end there. As the meeting broke up, Ethan gathered his notebook and prepared to leave, convinced he had already said more than anyone in that building wanted to hear. But as he passed one of the wall displays, a familiar sequence of diagnostic error codes flashed across the screen. The pattern triggered an uncomfortable memory from years earlier, when Ethan had worked as a diagnostic specialist for a vehicle software contractor before losing his job during a controversial data manipulation investigation that had never quite made sense to him. The same fault classification architecture, the same overwritten timestamp behavior, the same deliberate masking of critical errors. He stopped walking. Whatever was happening inside Langford Mobility Group was connected to something far older than a single damaged SUV, and for the first time he began to suspect that the rainy roadside encounter with Margaret Langford had reopened a chapter of his life that he had spent years trying to bury. Victoria called Ethan back to headquarters the following evening after quietly having her legal assistant investigate his background. What she discovered surprised her. Years earlier, Ethan had worked for Orion Vehicle Analytics, a respected diagnostic software contractor that supplied monitoring systems to several major automakers, and he had been on track for a senior engineering role before an internal investigation accused him of unauthorized access to proprietary safety data. The official record painted him as a disgraced employee who had altered diagnostic logs, but the supporting documents were strangely incomplete, with missing audit trails and contradictory timestamps that looked less like evidence and more like a conclusion assembled after the fact. Sitting across from Victoria in a smaller private office, Ethan finally told the full story he had avoided discussing for years. He explained that while working at Orion, he had discovered a hidden administrative function capable of remotely reclassifying serious vehicle faults as low-priority environmental events. When he prepared to report the vulnerability through internal channels, the relevant server records disappeared, and his own credentials were suddenly linked to unauthorized system access that he had never performed. By the time he realized what was happening, he had already been suspended, publicly blamed, and quietly pushed out of the industry. Victoria listened without interrupting, and when Ethan mentioned the name of the executive who had overseen Orion's legal response, her expression changed immediately. "Daniel Mercer," she said slowly. Ethan nodded. Victoria opened a file on her tablet and turned the screen toward him. Daniel Mercer was now serving as Chief Legal Officer for Langford Mobility Group and reported directly to Chairman Charles Whitaker. The connection hit both of them at the same moment. If Mercer had been involved in burying the original vulnerability at Orion, he now occupied a position that gave him broad access to Langford's autonomous vehicle safety infrastructure. "You think this is the same system," Victoria said quietly. "I think someone reused the same method," Ethan replied. "The suppression architecture is too similar to be coincidence." Victoria leaned back in her chair, visibly troubled. For the first time since this began, she looked less like a powerful CEO and more like someone realizing that the danger might be sitting inside her own executive suite. Despite the risk, she arranged for Ethan to review a limited set of internal test logs from Langford's upcoming autonomous fleet, a project called Horizon 1 that was scheduled for public launch in less than a month. Working late into the night in a secure engineering lab, Ethan compared the Horizon logs with the data from Margaret's SUV and quickly found the same hidden signature buried beneath layers of automated reporting. Critical steering and sensor synchronization faults were being quietly downgraded before they reached the main safety review dashboard. The implications were terrifying. If those faults activated under real-world driving conditions, a Horizon vehicle could suffer a catastrophic control failure while the system simultaneously reported that everything was operating normally. Before Ethan could finish documenting his findings, the lab doors opened and Charles Whitaker entered accompanied by Daniel Mercer and two senior security officers. Whitaker's expression was calm, almost amused. "This has gone far enough," he said. He accused Ethan of exploiting Victoria's concern to gain access to confidential corporate systems and suggested that a man with Ethan's history should be very careful about making accusations involving data manipulation. Mercer added that unauthorized review of Horizon test data could expose Ethan to serious legal consequences. Ethan expected Victoria to back down under the pressure, but instead she placed a printed copy of the anomaly report on the table between them. "Then explain these suppressed fault classifications," she said. Whitaker glanced at the report for only a second before his composure tightened almost imperceptibly. "Preliminary software noise," he replied. "Our engineers are already addressing it." Ethan shook his head. "Software noise doesn't reproduce the exact same suppression pattern that was used to disable your mother's SUV." The room went silent. Victoria looked directly at Whitaker, and for the first time since they had met, Ethan could see that her trust in the chairman had begun to crack. Whatever happened next, the conflict was no longer between a poor mechanic and a wealthy corporation. It was between the truth hidden in those diagnostic logs and the powerful men who seemed increasingly desperate to keep it buried. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for the following morning, and by the time Ethan arrived at Langford headquarters, reporters were already gathering outside the building after rumors of an internal crisis had begun leaking to the business press. Inside the executive boardroom, the atmosphere felt less like a corporate meeting and more like a courtroom waiting for a verdict. Charles Whittaker sat at the head of the table with the confidence of a man who believed he still controlled the outcome, while Daniel Mercer organized a stack of legal documents clearly prepared in advance. Several board members studied Ethan with open skepticism, and one of them whispered something about the mechanic with the fraud allegations, loud enough for him to hear. Victoria entered last, carrying a slim black folder and wearing an expression so composed that Ethan could not tell whether she was about to save his credibility or sacrifice it to protect the company. Whittaker opened the meeting by recommending that Victoria be formally censured for exposing confidential Horizon 1 data to an outside individual with what he described as a documented history of professional misconduct. Before the motion could proceed, Victoria interrupted him and requested that the board review newly recovered security evidence related to her mother's vehicle. The room's main display flickered on, showing dashboard camera footage from Margaret Langford's SUV. The video clearly captured a uniformed executive transportation technician opening the hood in a restricted parking area and working near the engine control module for several minutes before leaving without recording any authorized maintenance activity. A second display appeared beside it, showing access logs from the Horizon 1 test servers. Ethan had spent the entire previous night reconstructing deleted records using backup fragments that Victoria's internal cybersecurity team had quietly recovered. The restored logs revealed that critical fault classification rules had been modified from an executive administrative account linked directly to Daniel Mercer's office, and that the changes had received secondary authorization from Chairman Whittaker's own credentials less than 2 weeks before the scheduled Horizon launch. Mercer immediately claimed the credentials must have been compromised, but Ethan calmly walked the board through the technical sequence, demonstrating how the same suppression framework appeared in both Margaret's SUV and the autonomous fleet testing environment. He then ran a live simulation showing what would happen if the hidden trigger activated during highway operation. The projected result was devastating. Simultaneous steering instability and sensor desynchronization occurring while the monitoring system falsely reported nominal performance. An independent safety auditor whom Victoria had secretly retained confirmed that the reconstructed data originated from Langford's internal servers long before Ethan ever accessed the system, eliminating any plausible claim that he had fabricated the evidence. The final blow came when Margaret Langford herself entered the boardroom carrying a notarized copy of the company's original founding charter. As a major shareholder and widow of the company's founder, she invoked a dormant emergency governance clause allowing the chief executive to suspend the chairman's authority when credible evidence showed intentional endangerment of the founding family or deliberate concealment of a product safety threat. The board erupted into shocked discussion, but the evidence was now overwhelming. Investigators later uncovered encrypted communications showing that Whittaker had planned to allow a controlled Horizon 1 failure during the public launch, trigger a collapse in Langford's stock price, remove Victoria as CEO during the resulting crisis, and transfer key autonomous vehicle patents to a group of allied investors positioned to acquire the weakened company at a fraction of its value. Margaret's SUV had been used as a preliminary field test of the suppression system, and Ethan's unexpected roadside repair had exposed the entire operation before the larger scheme could unfold. Whittaker was stripped of his authority that same day, Mercer was suspended pending criminal investigation, and the Horizon 1 launch was halted until every affected system could be independently audited. A week later, Victoria visited Ethan's garage alone and offered him a senior safety position that would have erased every debt he owed, but Ethan surprised her by declining the corporate title. Instead, Victoria proposed something different, a formal partnership that certified Cole's auto and truck repair as an independent safety inspection center for Langford Mobility Group. Months later, a new sign hung above the patched old garage, and customers who once overlooked the small shop now drove across the city to have their vehicles inspected by the mechanic who had exposed a billion-dollar conspiracy simply because he stopped to help an elderly woman in the rain and refused to ignore what he saw beneath her hood.